Good evening, everyone. And you're probably not surprised that the Journal of the Evangelical Homiletics Society, and of course, as well, the Evangelical Homiletics Society, is wide awake. Back in September of 2020, their September 2020 release journal was released, and Scott M. Gibson is the general editor. I was suspecting there was kind of a leftward justice bent in the society, but on a lot of things I've been asleep for a little while, and so I started looking at some old online journals, and I thought, well, if you want to see how woke someone is, especially if I tell you what, if you're looking at a ministry or a church preacher, look and see what that person preached the Sunday after May 25, 2020. Look at what he preached, on beyond that, especially just getting a little ways beyond that. It's kind of like after September 1 of 2001, or September 11, 2001, I still remember what I preached on. That next Sunday, 5 days later, I preached on Psalm 23. But with this social justice narrative, their big key event was May 25, 2020. I want to just kind of do a running commentary on this introduction to the actual issue, okay? And also I'm noticing that there is an advertisement, earn your PhD in preaching at Baylor University. If you believe they believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, you're behind the times, because they certainly do not. All right, so The Urgency of Preaching in Challenging Times by Scott M. Gibson. I'm probably going to pause this occasionally to get my thoughts together. I've only read part of it so far. In the light of these challenging days of pandemic and prejudice, I already know this is going to be a joy. The editorial board urged that the September 20 edition of the Journal of the Evangelical Homiletics Society focus on the theme of preaching on race, racism, prejudice, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, etc. I don't know what all the etc. includes. Together, we agreed that a themed on this topic issue was indeed necessary. I'm not sure if that's a correct sentence or not. So what we're looking at preaching on the very issues you're hearing on the news every night. It reminds me of someone recently said, the world is watching. Preaching on race and racism, we've heard enough of that. Preaching on prejudice, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, etc. How much of this is really going on? This is a way you can you can basically just preach on broad things and never deal with the individual sin. The Society is well equipped to address this topic as demonstrated in the articles in this edition. Preachers are to preach the good news, the gospel, the life, death, burial, and resurrection, ascension, and promised return of Jesus Christ. This gospel is to extend into every aspect of life. It is an urgent message for congregations, classrooms, our country, our world. Without the gospel, all effort for change is limp. Well, that is true. That is very correct. Without the gospel. Our preaching, therefore, okay, because we have this gospel imperative, therefore it is to be empowered by gospel urgency. Okay, so the gospel is urgent. All right, so apparently preaching on race, racism, prejudice, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, all the words we're hearing on CNN and Fox every night. So preaching on these things, that's gonna make it really settle home. All right, so we want the gospel urgency to inform advocacy. We want gospel urgency to shape ministry with refugees. We want gospel urgency to influence academic pursuits. We want gospel urgency to infiltrate justice. We want gospel urgency to characterize our lives. We want gospel urgency to be reflected in our preaching, our teaching in the seminary classroom and church. Let's look at a couple of these things. We want gospel urgency to inform advocacy. Whom are we advocating for? We want gospel urgency to shape ministry with refugees. Okay. So are you saying that gospel urgency informs when we're dealing with people who might be in this country illegally or whatever? I mean, and I'm a libertarian that believes in borders only because we have to. because we give everything away. And that's the only reason why we have to deal with borders. This monopoly of force is giving everything away. But the thing is, gospel urgency. You're a sinner. Christ died for you. He raised from the dead. Sure, that's going to inform everything that we do, but you keep focusing, guy, here on these things on the left. We want, and I've dealt with refugees. I've dealt with people who were certainly not legally documented in this country, and I ministered to them. But we advocating? How are we advocating? Are we advocating to spend somebody else's money, to steal someone's money to support them? We want gospel urgency to characterize our lives. Okay, that's great. All right, this edition begins with a sermon by Gregory K. Holifield, who asks if Christians are awake to the gospel as it energizes social justice. Wow, there will have to be a part 2 to this video. Holifield begins with his own awakening to God's call for social justice in the prayer of John Stott, the legendary and instructive evangelical voice of the past. I'm not going to read all of that sentence, all of that paragraph about that particular sermon. The next sermon, the sermon is followed by an essay by Matthew D. Kim on the hidden and overt prejudice that has exasperated as a byproduct of the COVID-19 crisis. This is a manufactured crisis, by the way, resulting in myriad forms of racism, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, bigotry, hate crimes, murder, racial injustice, and the more in society and even in the church. What are we talking about? I guess I need to read this sermon. But if you look at the very first sentence and just think about it, really, or the very first paragraph, right now, what it's going to be. In the light of these challenging days of pandemic and prejudice. This is unbelievable. All right, so because a virus exists, and we can't even talk about this on many platforms, because this exists and people in the media and in the government are trying to scare us with this thing, okay? We're all supposed to be going around going, oh, pandemic, oh, scared to death, worried to death, shutting our churches down. And then a lot of these people who realize this is bunk are people who, for example, might be more conservative. And so I guess, of course, that can be translated somehow into racism, racial injustice. All these things, they're just vague. What are we talking about specifically? Well, I know the things that were going on in those few months. In this article and these sermons are just reflecting this garbage we've been hearing on the news, this narrative. After defining terms, looks like Kim's article, he offers 7 ways that preachers, pastors, and church leaders can respond to prejudice, xenophobia, racial injustice, and racism in our proclamation. Okay, it looks like we're going to have to look at that sermon as well. Next, Jesse L. Nelson provides a practical theology of preaching on racism. Here, Nelson addresses the why and how we should preach on racism. In addition, Nelson outlines a sermon series on which he preached about this very topic, providing readers with fodder for future sermons on racism while modeling an approach for the topic. The writer urges that the preachers, no matter what race, have the responsibility to preach on racism and to let congregations know that the Bible speaks against racism. Yeah, the Bible does speak against showing partiality. Okay? I'm telling you, I'm trying to find these racists. Especially the ones who are speaking about the white nationalist type racists, and I don't even want to use that term. Where are they? I'm only 52, but I can remember when there was more of it going on. Where are they? But now they say it's silent. Oh, it's so dangerous we don't even know what's out there. This is how crazy it is, and this is infiltrating evangelical institutions. Jared E. Alcantara explores the impact of racism on seminarians of color and makes important considerations for the classroom. Impact of racism? What's going on here? Alcantara carefully examines what he terms flashpoints of racialization, invisibility, caricature, and taxation that ethnic minorities experience. The article discusses what's good. He talks about taxation, pretty much as theft. The article discusses a helpful way forward for teachers of preachers as they engage their students in the classroom. So now we're going to move this pedagogical approach into the classroom, so we can get another whole generation of Gen Z social justice warriors. In his investigations of Ephesians 2 1 to 22, breath of fresh air, Abraham Kuravilla. Oh, man. I hope he doesn't do me wrong in this article. This guy's great. I really read a lot of his stuff when I was doing my doctoral work in preaching. This passage sermon study provides an encouraging word in times like these. As Kuravilla notes, right now everything is broken, undone, chaotic, but one day in God's grand design, everything is going to be integrated, harmonized, and aligned to Christ, the unifying end of the cosmos. The entire universe, both its heavenly and its earthly dimensions, from black holes to badgers, from nebulas to nightingales, from transgalactic forces to intramolecular forces, from plants to potatoes, everything is being administered, arranged, harmonized, consummated in Christ. This is the grand design, the zenith of creation. What a day that will be. All right. So I'm not sure exactly where Abraham Kuravilla goes there. Abraham Kuravilla is a really good preacher. He has written a lot on pericopal theology and actually practicing dermatologist in Dallas, Texas. And I don't know, 17, 18 years ago, maybe 2005, something like that, he posted on his Facebook, I think it was his Facebook, that he was going to go to seminary. Well, he sure did. He already had a seminary degree, but he went to get his PhD back then, and he's been a great teacher. I'm not going to look at all the rest of these introductions to these sermons, but it's just to give you a taste of what's going on with the Journal of the Evangelical Homiletics Society. Right now, if you're looking for good preaching sources, Abraham Kuravilla's got a site called Homiletics, and it's spelled Homelite Homiletics, IX, okay, instead of CS. You may want to check that out sometime. But anyway, let's just go a little bit deeper as we move forward and see how far gone this society is into wokeness. Goodbye.